Good morning to some of you. Good afternoon to many of us. I am here in the land of Israel on vacation, but I'm still working. So Dee, tell John
We're going to get to see you on Wednesday.
It's true. Dee,
Yeah.
tell John to punch the clock downstairs for me, okay? Make sure I punch in and punch out today.
I'll say
okay.
one thing, even though we're working. You know what Juji is in English, right? Juji is Susan.
Ah, interesting.
Oh,
I didn't know that.
yeah.
That's cool. Juji
Yeah.
will come by later.
Say servus to your mother-in-law.
Oh, very good. Yes, servus. Yes, she knows. She knows. Chocolok, that's another one, which is kisses. So anyhow, I am here in Jerusalem. It is a balmy 88 degrees. I had a nice fast yesterday, and then this morning, because I need to get on local time, I woke up early and went for a run. It was the slowest run I believe I've ever taken in my entire life. It was 14 minutes. I did 4.3 miles in 14-minute miles. It's like D could walk faster, almost certainly. So anyways, but it was a good run. And then we took the family took the tunnel tour, the famous tunnel tour, which was very good, except I just posted to Twitter my only one complaint, which was our tour guide, who was a frum woman and very knowledgeable, very wonderful tour guide, lots of informative things. Also stated categorically that Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, was the place where Abraham took Isaac to sacrifice him in chapter 22 of Genesis, which is fine. But she said that he was 37 years old when he took him. And I said to myself, yeah, that's what Rashi says. But I'm pretty sure the other commentators disagree. And so I had to go back. I literally pulled it open. And lo and behold, Ibn Ezra and Ramban both disagree. Ibn Ezra fervently believes that Isaac was 13 years old when Abraham brought him up. I have always held by that opinion. So I'm a little annoyed that we're holding by Rashi exclusively at the Western Wall. I feel that that's an affront, but anyway, so, we have a good class today. We actually have
opinion.
Go ahead, Joe.
It's only one tour guide's opinion.
It's only one. Right. I should have stopped her and said, can I get several of the tour guides in here to provide their commentary?
My daughter and her partner were also on the tunnel tour, and maybe they were on the same one. I don't know, because they're not back yet.
we were like the only English speakers on the tour. There was
but they're Hebrew speakers.
Right. We selected the English tour. So
okay.
We wound up with a bunch of Russians.
Yeah.
The one difference, I've taken it before. My in-laws wanted the kids to see this tour. The one difference from the last time I took it, which was like 5 or 10 years ago, was they've just built this really opulent, ridiculous synagogue inside the tunnel. And it is completely over the top. I mean, and there's a small controversy brewing around it, although it's not a controversy that anyone will actually pay attention to, which is that it is open on Shabbat for anyone. For the rest of the week, you have to rent it. And we happened to be going in right when a bar mitzvah was coming out. And we could tell from the attire and the fact that they had their own private tour bus that was festooned with its own name of the bar mitzvah boy on the outside, that these people, as my friend Jamie used to say, came from the high windows. So the question that I was asking my in-laws is it really okay to have a kind of a pay-for-play synagogue right next to the Kotel? It feels a little weird to me, but to each their own.
There are a lot of weird things at the Kotel.
That is very true. That is very true. I made great pains to point my kids in the direction of the egalitarian Kotel. So today we're going to start off with our text. We're in a really interesting section of the Gemara today. We will probably make some decent headway. But where we start off is going to be a little bit weird, and you'll see in a second. I'll make it a little bit bigger, and then when we jump in, we'll jump in. We're going to take probably a decent sized pause because the next text, and I'll show you why in a second. The next text is there is what is referred to in the yeshivish and rabbinic world as a monster Tosafot on the next page. So hopefully you can all see this well. But I'll reread this one and we'll do a quick review of last week for those who missed it. And then we will move on. So we're picking up on the top of page 33A. And what I learned this morning in prepping, or this afternoon really, is that 33A is really short. And you'll find out why, okay? Noreen, you are going to read the English for us, okay?
Okay, will do.
Manitin mani, Abba Sha'ulhi, Titania, Abba Sha'ul Omer, Maim Oyain Mutar, Kedei Letzachzecho, Me Raglaim Asur, Mipnei Ha-Kavod.
The Gemara asks, who is the Tana of the Mishnah? The Gemara answers, it is Abba Shaul, as it is taught in a Baraita that Abba Shaul says, with regard to water or wine, one is permitted to pour these liquids into a shofar on Rosh Hashanah in order to make it sound clear. However, with regard to urine, one is prohibited to do so due to the respect that must be shown to the shofar. Although urine is beneficial, it is disrespectful to place it in a shofar, which serves for a mitzvah.
Great. So this is what we kind of focused on last week, which is the strangeness of the idea around putting urine on a shofar. Although, as we talked about last week, there's a logic to it, which is that, and I actually did additional research after class about the positive properties of urine, which is that urea has the ability to serve as a polishing agent. And so it makes logical sense that one might use it to shine their shofar. However, obviously, no, because it would be inappropriate to do something, you know, kind of so disgusting as to add something like urine to a holy item. However, we also talked about last week that the rabbis discussed there were other things that people might be involved in that were kind of yucky, but were kind of normal also because a lot of these ritual items were used frequently and practically. So, and people were much more, you know, kind of, I was going to use the phrase Native American, you know, you use the whole buffalo in the sense that like you took advantage of all the different materials you could in order to, you know, shine or polish something. But anyway, so this is the first part of our Mishnah, which deals with putting cuts in a shofar on Yontiv. So the question being, if it's Rosh Hashanah, can you cut an uncut shofar if it's the only shofar around? The answer is D'oraita, no. D'Rabbanan, they also prohibited it, even with a different version, a different vessel for cutting. So that's where we leave off. As I was preparing, though, I went down to line 4 and then 5. Oh, Olivia, go ahead before we keep going.
Am I seeing that the word for urine is my regalim, like water of the legs?
Yeah, we
May
talked about
reglaim,
it.
yeah.
We talked about
And
that,
our
yeah.
Israelis last week, well done, Olivia. Our Israelis last week found that to be, they thought that was a euphemism because the modern Hebrew word for peeing is, or urine, is not that. But I, who've only studied Mishnah and Talmud and Chassidut, and my modern Hebrew is lousy, right? Like I'm here in Israel and I can function, right? I'm fine with it, but there's always a 50-50 chance that I'm going to quote the Gemara to a bus driver rather than actually say something in correct Hebrew, because I literally don't know, you know, the way to say things. Like I have said accidentally to people, like when you know, asked something like shtika de what is it? Shtika de kahoda de dumya, right? Which is like silence is assent, but that's really Aramaic and Hebrew and not really the way an Israeli would say silence is assent. You know, there's a number of phrases that I've learned. And so anyways, me reglaim is for me a Mishnaic word for peeing or for pee. For our Israelis, they know that the word is, I believe Marian taught me last week, setin.
Shetin.
Seten, right? Very good.
Shetin, the shin.
Seten. From the verb lahashtin, to pee, right? So anyways, so interesting. Well said. All right, we're going to move on from shofar. But anyways, what I was saying was, as I was prepping today's daf, I was skimming down and I was like, oh, how far am I going to get? So I did 5, I did 6, I did 7, I did 8, I did 9. And all of a sudden I'm on 33b. I'm like, what? That is a very short daf. So I will show you the daf and you'll see a little bit why this is the way it is. So this is a website called Daf Yomi, and you could pull up any page from the internet. And this is what a Vilna Shas of the Talmud would look like. Now, the Steinsaltz pagination is slightly different, but it always follows the Vilna. He arranges things differently, but you know, a Steinsaltz, a Vilna Shas, especially if you're going to spend, you know, weeks on one page, you can flip through it. And if you're like me and you were forced in rabbinical school to learn, you know, 25 blot of Gemara like it was the back of your hand, you could flip to certain pages and just glance at it from a distance, not even be able to make out the words and see the shape of it and be like, oh, that's Elu Mitziot Shelo ve'elu Chai v'chakris, right? Because we spend so much time on one page. So this page, as you'll notice, it's very little. The middle is the Gemara. It's very little Gemara. And then there's this giant pericope on the left side, and it goes down and down and down and down. I'll make it smaller so that you can get a sense of it, right? So there's tiny little bit of Talmud, and then this thing on the left is what we refer to as a monster Tosafot. On the right side, we have Rashi. Rashi is always on the inside of the page. They always would say in yeshiva, Rashi is your inside guy because he's going to give you the inside of the text. Tosafot is Rashi's grandson, whose name was Rabbeinu Tam, and his buddies, and they were French 12th and 13th century commentators who generally took Rashi apart, and they were trying to get often at the law underpinning what the Talmud was doing. Sometimes they get really nasty, and they really try and pull apart a complicated piece of logic and break it down from its 3-dimensional self into a 4-dimensional and 5-dimensional self. I am not a great Talmud scholar, and so whenever Tosafot would come up, I would break my teeth on it and really struggle. When I had to do my 10 daf exam, I had to do a 60 daf exam in rabbinical school to graduate. The 10 daf exam included Tosafot, and Dr. Rabbi Gail Leibovitz, when I finished the exam, she came back to me 2 days later and said, congratulations, you passed. I said, how did I do? She said, let's not talk about it. You passed, right? The written section was not my forte. And that's because Tosafot is really hard. And Tosafot takes Talmud, which is like juggling 5 or 6 balls, and turns it into juggling 8 or 9 or 10 logical principles at once. And so you really have to have full acquisition intellectually of the text. And it's really, really, really rigorous and challenging. I would say there are not many people, rabbis, Talmud scholars, yeshiva students, who are even adequate at Tosafot, let alone good at it. So when you hear someone is a gaon or a genius, or they're like a real Talmud Chacham, and they can like chop a Tosafot, it really means something. It means they have a real brain that can work. Now, I just will point out one last thing. There was a New York Times article a few months back about a huge Talmud Chacham in Bnei Brak, but it said that he would study upwards of 14 hours a day, sometimes 18 hours a day. And on the other hand, they said that his students and his wife would bring him his tea and his meals, and that they had never in their entire lives seen him make tea, and they were unsure whether he knew how to do it, right? So can break a Tosafot down and explain it in an erudite and brilliant way, cannot make tea, okay? I, on the other hand, cannot do Tosafot, can make tea. Okay. All right, Rabbi Judy, go ahead.
So is it Rashi's grandson is Rabbeinu Tam?
Yep. And we're
and he's very persnickety, and he's very very detail oriented, and he's one of the ones who likes to break down what Rashi said.
Yes.
Find flaw.
That's right. The book, well said, Rabbi Judy. The book on Rabbeinu Tam is that he likes to disagree with his grandfather. This text that we're going to be doing, we're not going to do the whole Tosafot. I'm just going to give you a taste. But this Tosafot is really easy. It's not it's not a difficult one at all. And we're not really going to go into depth about it. I'm just going to give you the rough hit of it. The fact that I can even give you a rough hit tells you how easy this one is. The reason that I'm interested in this Tosafot will become evident immediately. It is very interesting. It is extremely halachically important for progressive Jews, and you'll see why in a second.
I just wanted to comment. Did I just lose my thought? I lost my thought. Okay, when I think of it, I'll.
Great. With that, Elisheva, why don't you read this in the Hebrew, in the English, and I'll read it in the Hebrew. We're on number 5, so it's right on your screen. Ein ma'akvin et hatinokot mi litkoa, ha nashim ma'akvin, v'hatanya ein ma'akvin lo et hanashim v'lo et hatinokot mi litkoa b'yom tov. Amar Abaye lo kasha, ha Rabbi Yehuda, ha Rabbi Yossi, v'Rabbi Shimon.
The Mishnah further teaches one need not prevent children from sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara infers, if women wish to sound the shofar, one indeed prevents them from doing so. The Gemara asks, isn't it taught in a baraita that one does not prevent women or children from sounding the shofar on a festival? The Gemara answers that Abaye said, this is not difficult. This Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, while that baraita is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon.
Okay, so we have a really interesting fight in the Talmud, and it has a logical problem. And for us as moderns, it has a moral and misogynistic problem, right? And that's why we're gonna go full stop and spend some time on it, right? So the basic thing is this: the Mishnah says, don't stop children from blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah, right? And of course, logically and halachically, we know that a child cannot discharge the obligation of a major, of an adult. And therefore, when it says ein ma'akvin, we don't stop them. What it means is, like, let your kids learn to practice the shofar, but it doesn't count, right? You have to have an adult come and blow the shofar, but we don't stop. Just because they can't fulfill the mitzvah doesn't mean they're not allowed to, right? Which is a great kind of little halachic gray area, right? So there's this category that we've discussed multiple times in this class. There are several halachic categories in the Mishnah and the Baraitot that deal with slaves, women, and minors, or deaf mutes, slaves, and the mentally kind of confounded, for lack of a more appropriate term. These are categories that are often raised as people who get put aside into separate halachic categories. They either are put as, for lack of a better term, lower halachic status, meaning they cannot fulfill obligations, but sometimes they're allowed to participate in obligations without being able to lead the obligation. So, like, a great example of this is women are not allowed to be in traditional old school non-egalitarian Judaism. Women are not allowed to be shaliach tzibor for devar shebekdusha, right? A sacred act like the Shmona Esrei, the Baruch Hu, or the blessings over and the recitation of Torah. But there are certain things that are permitted for women to do, even still, like the reading of the Megillah for Purim, as long as they are not around men. And some would even argue women have the ability to read even for men, depending on who you paskin by. But that's because of the status that the Talmud in the Mishnah and the Gemara has laid out. Here we have an interesting, strange kind of addition, right? The Mishnah says nothing about women. It doesn't mention them at all. However, we get Vehatanya, and Vehatanya introduces a baraita, and the baraita says, "Ein ma'akvin lo et hanashim v'lo et hatinokot militkoa b'yom tov." Right? One does not prevent women or children from sounding the shofar, but the Gemara, so that's the baraita, which says explicitly you don't prevent women, children, or women from blowing shofar. But if you go back a line, you get Ein makvin et hatinokot militkoa, ha nashim makvin, right? So it says you don't prevent children from blowing, but you do prevent women from blowing. So the Gemara's immediate inference is that the enunciation of children as being permitted to blow without them being added into the broader halakha category of like women, slaves, and minors implies that only children can practice blowing shofar on Yontiv. Women and slaves, hypothetically, are forbidden. And this is an inference that the Gemara makes that then is immediately rejected by an argument from the Baraita. The Baraita says, but we have a Baraita that says specifically that women and children are not prevented from blowing the shofar. So the Talmud suddenly has a fight on its hands. It's got two Tanaitic era statements, which the Gemara infers from the Mishnah contradicts one another. So now we got a fight brewing, and we got to figure out how to resolve it. They resolve it very simply. And Rabbi Abaye, who is a later Amora, he's like fourth generation Amora, says, this is not a problem. Lo kasha. Ha Rabbi Yehuda, ha Rabbi Yossi, v'Rabbi Shimon, right? So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is the author of the Mishnah, and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon are the author of the second opinion. Now, the only problem with that is we don't actually have a resolution as to who wins the fight. And more importantly, so now I've gotten into the nerdery. Joe's got his hand up, but I'll answer you a second. We've got a problem, which the problem of the nerdery around like which authoritative opinion is more important is less important to us as moderns who are egalitarians than, I think, trying to pick apart the Gemara. In the conservative movement, we generally think that you can hit the reverse gear to the Talmud if there is a compelling moral or modern Judaism reason, which means if you can find an angle for why women's rights should be expanded using a line in the Talmud, you should do it, right? And our rabbis in the conservative movement have done this very often. So with this, I wanted to show you this monster Tosafot. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it to you because it's really huge. Joe, do you want to ask your question before we do the monster Tosafot?
So think of me as ignorant. So doesn't the Baraita come after the Gemara? And if so, how can the Gemara refute the Baraita?
The Gemara chronologically comes after the Baraita. The Baraita in the pagination comes after. So chronology is the most important thing rather than sentence order in the Talmud. So a Baraita and a Mishnah, generally a Mishnah trumps a Baraita, but not always. But the Gemara is basically what you're seeing here, Joe, is the Gemara has made basically a false inference in the first line that you see. And in the third line that you see where it says Amar Abaye lo kasha, they reject the false inference, right? They basically say, this is not, what the Gemara inferred up above is not necessarily so. Does that sort of answer you?
Yeah.
Okay. Olivia and then Marian.
I was wondering if children includes boys and girls, especially since the plural here is a feminine plural. Hatinokot.
Tinokot.
Well, that's,
Code is always that.
Yeah.
yeah,
It's just the declension of the verb in plural. That's all, or the noun in the plural. But your point, Olivia, still stands, which is the assumption regarding the word tinakot would be both boys and girls, at least for me, in the sense that a minor is a minor, right? An 11-year-old boy cannot lead shachrit any differently than an 11-year-old girl can, right? Their gender, interestingly enough, has no kind of effect to that. Now, the difference, of course, in modern Judaism is in the modern Orthodox world, the women are not prepared for leading and for teaching and for learning, whereas the boys are. And we don't know whether that was the case back then. In fact, in knowing the story of Bruria, one might make the argument that it was not so back then. Although there are those scholars, and I know, Olivia, you know a lot about Bruria, you've taught about Bruria. There are those scholars that suggest that Bruria is not actually a real existing person, but rather a figment of the rabbi's imagination. I read a wonderful essay about this about 15 years ago, which was basically and I wish I knew, I could ask Dr. Aryeh Cohen, he would probably remember it. The essay's thought process was effectively, Bruria is the answer to the question that the rabbis posed to themselves. What would it be like if there was a woman as smart as us, and how would we destroy her? It's a really brilliant read in rabbinic male-dominated misogyny. I can see Elisheva getting frustrated at the very mention of the possibility that Bruria did not.
It's why if she hadn't been real, it wouldn't have been necessary for them to concoct the slander they did about her. They only needed that because she was very real, and they didn't like it.
I should find this essay for you.
Wait, what's the slander? We
There's a
can't
story-
go
I
on.
forget the details of the slander, but
Yeah.
later on, there's this horrible story of some horrible thing she really didn't do. But it's designed to destroy her reputation.
The essay basically says that that is a backward engineered, kind of takedown of Bruria, which points out that it's like an attempt to say women should never learn Gemara, or never be Talmidei Chachamim, right? The story, very quickly, Judy, and I may mix it up, is basically one of Rebbe Meir, Bruria's husband's students, is kind of lured into a scheme to entice her to adultery. And I don't recall if the adultery is ever consummated, but the implication that she could be so wayward is proof that women shouldn't be such Talmidei Chachamim altogether. Yeah. But it's the basis for this essay. But by the way, the essay is merely an essay. It's a 20th century, professor of Talmud trying to, throw gasoline on a fire. It's a brilliant essay, though. If I can find it, I'll bring it up to you. Marion, go ahead, and then Olivia, jump back in before we do this Tosafot, some of the monster Tosafot.
Okay, I just wanted to point out that the fact that the issue was not resolved is part of the beauty of the Talmud, in that there are lots of questions, and that none of the opinions are discarded and thrown away. And in other words, that we interpret it as we see fit, which is something that some groups do not believe in.
Right.
Yeah.
Spoken like a true.
As we listen to the judges of our own time, which we are instructed to do in the Torah, which many people don't pay attention to.
Marion, spoken like a true conservative rabbi. So well done. Conservative rabbis like to hit the reverse button all the way back to the Talmud when they feel the need, because otherwise Jewish law doesn't need to be, kind of completely unwound. Like, for example, if we were to unwind Jewish law backwards to the Talmud, conservative kashrut would be vastly different than Orthodox kashrut, and that is not the case. So there's a certain degree to which, in many ways, the conservative movement continues forward. And by the way, I did too. In rabbinical school, in conservative rabbinical school, we are all trained to move forward, which means we learned Tosafot, and then we learned the Rif, Rabbi Alfasi, and then we learned the Ran, Rabbi Nisim, and then we learned their buddy, Rabbeinu Asher. And Rabbeinu Asher's son was named the Arbaturim, and the Arbaturim is the basis for the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch is the law code that we all follow today. I had to learn all that stuff in rabbinical school. So if you want to unwind the tape and reverse a decision, you had better be ready to go down all the way back through all the layers, or you better have a really compelling reason to go backwards, like the fact that conservative synagogues' parking lots are all full on Shabbos, even though none of you should be driving because everyone's moved from the city to the suburbs, right? Which is the classic example. All right, Olivia, go ahead.
Just to not lose Bruria too much. I pasted a link to my favorite book about women in Talmud, which is Tal Ilan's Mine and Yours Are Hers, which works very hard to compile the historical Bruria, looking at first a mention of her teaching in the Baraita, and then kind of tracking how chronologically with the ages of the sources, she gets attached to more and more men, to her husband, Rabbi Meir, and to her father, Rabbi Turadian, who's one of the 10 martyrs, and how this is the fate of many women in Talmud who seem at first in an older source to not really be associated with a man, and then need to be paired up with one so they can be reasonable to the rabbis. It's a brilliant text. And if it's ever less than $60, or if $60 is nothing to you, I recommend adding it to your library, and then to whatever libraries you're associated with.
Wonderful. That was a great addition to our class today. Thanks, Olivia. I really appreciate it. It's interesting that Beruria takes a kind of we got onto the topic of Beruria. You'll see that we have another extremely famous woman mentioned in the side of our text. And this Tosafot is kind of important and legendary. And so I'll read as much of it as I can before you all get bored of me reading and translating Hebrew kind of poorly. Ha Rabbi Yehuda, ha Rabbi Yossi. That's our Dibor Amachil. That's the beginning of our text. So that's what's bothering Tosafot. Omer Rabbeinu Tam, Afal Gav Destam Matnitin Karebi Yehuda, Halacha Karebi Yossi. Okay, so Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, says even though a standard Mishnah is always believed to be according to Yehuda, the law here is according to Rabbi Yossi. Denimu ko imo, that the point is with him. Okay, Umase Rav dehamotzi tfilin. Eruvin, Michal bat Shaul haita manachat tfilin v'ishto shel Yona shehaita ola l'regel v'hahu uvda de perek ein dorshin. Okay, let me explain that. Basically, what's being said here is, and this is similar to the story that Rav brings forth on tefillin, which you can find in Tractate Eruvin, page 96a, of Michal bat Shaul, who put on tefillin, and she was the wife of Yonah, and she went up on the regel, Vahahu uvda de parek ein dorshin, and this is relayed as a fact, and it is not explicated. It might be that we're talking about that she went up on Yom Tov and she gave a sermon, and was not stopped, right? So what is Tosafot talking about here? What Tosafot is talking about here is they're bringing up other examples that help Rabbi Yossi in his argument that women are not prevented from blowing shofar on a festival. How do they derive this? They basically have said, we have a parallel text in Eruvin of a woman who puts on tefillin and is not prevented, right? Velo ma'akvin is kind of, or ein ma'akvin is the important kind of halachic idea that Tosafot are running with. By the way, this is standard Tosafot. They don't bother to tell you what's bothering them. They just start throwing sources out. And if you don't know what the source is about, because I told you a few words, but then I explained some other words that aren't actually there that I just happen to know. I know the story of Michal bat Shaul. If I had not known it, I could not have helped you here. I would have looked at Tosafot, turned blue, and moved on. So anyways, what are they doing? They're pointing out that there are other cases in the Talmud where women are allowed to do either Devar Shebek Dusha or Mitzvat Aseh Shazman Grama, like positive time-bound commandments, and they're not stopped, right? So women putting on tefillin is not a mitzvah, but not forbidden. And that is the basis by which the entire conservative movement kind of expanded the category of women in Jewish law. It was how Joel Roth originally allowed Jewish women to become rabbis, and then eventually we elaborated on his tshuva to decide that women could do all the things and were probably obligated in all the things that men were obligated in. So this line on your right is the beginning of it. And the line in front of you in Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of it. You get just a few words, right? Ein ma'akvin lo hanashim ve'lo hatinukot. Those few words of a baraita are the genesis for the entire existence of women's rights in Judaism on some level. And that's why I thought it was worthwhile to stop. We'll go a little further. Dehavonuhu le'ezrat nashim, and the establishment in the women's section. V'samchu alav nashim kedei la'asot nachat ruach lenashim. And it was relied upon them, the women, in order that they should bring the Ruach HaKodesh to the women. So this implies that there was something going on in the women's section of the Beit HaMikdash, and I don't know that source in Chagiga, so I couldn't, I apologize for not looking up parallel sources in 4 different other Masechtot of Gemara on this day, but I'm on vacation, I'll remind you, but another day, right? The other thing is, we could stop and spend 2-3 solid weeks on this daf, which is what one of my rabbis in rabbinical school would have done. But I think getting the gist of it and having a little bit of forward progress was fine. Let me go a little farther to go, because this is actually a line that's kind of important and easy to understand. Umutarot levarech al mitzvot ase shazman grama afal gav de pitrot min davar ha mitzvah hahi umit askot bahen kamo michal bat kushi. Okay, this is a really important sentence. Really, really important. Let me translate. And it is permitted to bless on a positive commandment, which is time bound, even though women are exempted from a matter of mitzvah, and they should, and when they busy themselves with it, like Michal Bat Kushi did, Shahita Gam Mevarechet V'Teda de Amrinan Perak HaChovel, and she blesses, as we all know, in Perak HaChovel on page 87a. What just happened there is really interesting, right? We went from the Gemara saying women and children should not blow shofar to the Baraita saying, no, women and children should blow shofar, to Rabbeinu Tam jumping in and saying, actually, not only should women and children blow shofar, but perhaps this is akin to the point in the Gemara where women put on tefillin. And not only that, the question is raised here, if a woman is going to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, should she say the bracha, right? Now, the logic here is, if a woman cannot exempt a man's obligation for a positive town-bound commandment, then obviously she shouldn't say the blessing, right? Because she's of a kind of a lower status. Now, there are lots of things that Jews do where they do the thing without a blessing, right? And it's still okay. There is, like, for instance, when you put on your arm and your head tefillin, there is some unclarity as to whether one recites one blessing or 2. In fact, if you put on tefillin and you say Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed after you flip the straps of your head over your shoulder, the reason in text of why you do that is you say Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto because you're not sure you're allowed to say a separate blessing over the head tefillin. And when you say that separate blessing, if you said a bracha levatla, if you said an additional blessing that you really shouldn't have said because the arm tefillin and the head tefillin are actually one mitzvah, Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto functionally has the purpose of being an apology. Oops, I screwed up, God. I didn't know that it was one blessing instead of 2. I've been doing this every day of my life. I'm so sorry. So the logical principle here is probably women shouldn't say a blessing when they blow shofar. And yet I just read, Umutarot levarech al ha-mitzvah aseh shezman grama. We just read straight as day that women should say a blessing over the blowing of shofar. So if anybody ever turns to you and says women can't blow shofar, you can point to Rosh Hashanah 33a, the Tosafot that starts out, Ha Rebbe Yehuda, Ha Rebbe Yossi. And you could blow some frum guy's mind by pointing this out to them and say, like, actually, we're supposed to blow shofar according to the Baraita, and according to Rabbeinu Tam, we're also supposed to recite the blessing, right? At that point, that guy, his brain will dribble out of his ear, and small smoke clouds will form from the side of his head. Because these are the, by the way, these are the kind of Tosafot, these are the kind of texts that you very rarely stumble across in Judaism. The expansive text that allows for the tradition to grow and breathe from the most traditional of sources, right? So clearly you see why I'm absolutely in love with Rabbeinu Tam today. Rabbi Judy, go ahead.
Could one assume that the women could blow the shofar if they were allowed to fulfill the commandment to other women rather than to a mixed group? Do they talk about that at all?
It's a great question. I'm going to speedball two halachas together in order to kind of answer that question. And the answer is, I don't really know. Psak halacha for a conservative rabbi, for me, for an egalitarian conservative rabbi, to be very honest, I think Rabbeinu Tam is very interesting. I'll answer it from the Frumkeit perspective in a second. But first, let me answer as a conservative rabbi. As a conservative Jew, as a really egalitarian, progressive Jew, as someone who has read Judith Hauptman and read Rachel Adler, I don't give a flying fig what Rabbeinu Tam says here on some level. I love it, right? I love it, but I also don't care because women to me are equal to men, and therefore a woman who's an awesome Shaliach Tzibor, right? When Rabbi Amy Bardak gets up there and does Musaf, I don't have there's not an inkling in the back of my brain, not a synapse, not a single cell in my brain is saying, I wonder if she's truly fulfilling my mitzvah for me because she's a woman. It doesn't occur to me even a little bit, right? The women are equal to the men and that's it, right? But to your answer, Judy, the reason that women only read Megillah to each other in a traditional community on Purim is because of Kol Isha, right? Because the singing of a woman is believed to be by traditional men alluring, right? That is actually, there's a minyan down the street here in Emek Rephaim that doesn't hold by that, which is why women can read from the Torah and women can do Psukei de Zimra, right? Kol Isha is actually a much later idea. If I'm not mistaken, Kol Isha does not appear in the Talmud at all. I think it's an idea that appears in later codes all the way into like the 15th and 16th century. And I am a snob when it comes to later sources, right? Anything after like the 11th century is basically just, a fad, this is just the hip thing the kids are into these days, but it ain't going to stick, right? I go back to the Gemara for the basis of law. The other thing that I was going to say is from a Frumkeit perspective, it's questionable whether when Rabbeinu Tam says she's permitted to bless on it, whether what he's implying there is, and I'm going to predict what a real Frum rabbi would say, whether what he's implying there is her blowing of shofar would fulfill the mitzvah for other people, or whether it's really in the case of like, she's by herself at home, the men are off at synagogue, she wants to blow shofar. Should she blow shofar with or without a blessing, since there's like some doubt as to whether she would be permitted to do it? And the answer is, from Rabbeinu Tam, she should do it, right? The Gemara is probably in a grayer area where they're not entirely sure whether she's permitted to blow it at all, and if she's blowing it at all, whether she's fulfilling even her own mitzvah. Right? We know that in the Frum world, their argument would ultimately be probably 1, she shouldn't blow it. 2, if she did blow it, she should have a man come and blow it later to really fulfill the mitzvah. And 3, she definitely shouldn't blow it with a bracha, right? And I would say that Rabbeinu Tam is implying all 3 of those things are probably wrong, right? That realistically, a woman should blow shofar, she should do it with a blessing, and she probably, although not certainly, can fulfill other women's mitzvah. The last thing I'll say is this. There's a major section in halachic codes that deals with the question of why women can't lead, why Amy Bardak, her Musaf, might not be okay for Rabbi Goodman if we were not both conservative rabbis, and I didn't think all that was Narishkeit, which is the Talmud and really the Mikra Gedola, the Mishnah Berurah, one of the later 19th century codes, suggests that there's a problem if a woman gets up to be Shaliach Tzibor, because the assumption, according to Mishnah Berurah, is that a woman who leads the community in tefillah is only doing it because all the men are ignoramuses and none of them knows how to lead services, right? That's one of those areas where I get right off the train, because like, I know very well that like, not only are the women equal in davening to me, a lot of the women are better at davening than me, right? I'm not the best davener in the world. I didn't go to rabbinical school. I didn't go to cantorial school. I went to rabbinical school. So, you know, I make mistakes all the time. There are lots of women who are better at davening than me. So it doesn't even occur to me. And that kind of idea in the modern world where women are doctors and lawyers and, you know, Baruch Hashem, someday a president of the United States, like, doesn't occur to me. All right. Any further comments on this like long feminist extravaganza we've gone on?
I just, to go back to the very beginning when we started to talk about this, an argument can be made. I'm just thinking of today's practice among Orthodox, not conservative or reform or renewal or anything like that, but among Orthodox, that little girls and little boys equally can run to their daddies in the or their grandpas in the male part of the synagogue, and a question is never raised. Little kids of either gender are running back and forth between the two sides. But if a woman would do that, that would be a whole other thing. So right. On that note, women and little kids, rather regardless of their gender, can blow shofar, but that doesn't mean that women can.
Right.
Because the little children are not a threat. Yep.
The text continues.
The question mark at the end of that.
No, it's good. I'm just going to sum up what I just read, and we're not going to go into it, which is the Tosafot continues to break down the question of what can women do and not do by quoting a parallel text about discharging obligations on Yom Tov, and then getting into issues of tzitzit, lulav, tefillin, Megillah, Ner Chanukah, Sukkah, Havdalah, right? It's like, and then it sort of quotes a couple other sources and kind of gets into questions of like, what other commandments might women partake of or not partake of, blessings they might say and not say. So they're going to go, this is like, this monster Tosfot here is a huge area to kind of question like, what can women do and what can't they do, and what's permitted and what's forbidden. But we're going to keep going because this is not an advanced codes class, which I am not qualified to teach in the first place. They're going to keep going actually, and they're going to source their sources a little bit. But our halachic discourse on so forth is more or less at least on a pause until someone else has something else interesting to say. So I'm just going to check the chat and see if anybody. There was one other thing that I was going to bring up. When I wanted to see if anybody cited this Baraita, cited this Tosafot in a women's kind of Torah opinion, and behold, it's cited in a piece on from Women of the Wall, right? The women's group that takes a women's leadership role in reading Torah at the Western Wall on Rosh Chodesh and getting a lot of things thrown at them by the Charedim. It says here, women are exempted from the biblical law of tzitzit. Women who want to wear tzitzit wrap themselves in it without a blessing. If they want to perform them without a blessing, they are not prevented, right? That's Rambam quoting laws of tzitzit. And then it says, however, in contrast to Rambam's ruling, Rabbeinu Tam, a French Tosafist and leading halachic authority in his generation, says that women can recite the blessings over positive time-bound commandments, such as wearing tzitzit. And you all know that because we just learned it, right? So you are now as erudite as the advanced halachic commentators who help Women of the Wall provide their source material to their women for why they're allowed to do their thing. So I thought that was really cool, right? This is an interesting source. If you'd like to read it later, it's womenofthewall.org.il/women and talit. It'll give you like a quick and dirty version of some of the halachic discourse that comes down off of this issue. All right, back to our Talmud. I'll read the Aramaic. Joe Jolson, you're going to read my English. Titania, daber el b'nei Yisrael. B'nei Yisrael somchin, ve'ein benot Yisrael somchot. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Shimon omer, nashim somchot rishut.
As it is taught in a Baraita, speak to the children of Israel, and he shall place his hands upon the head of the burnt offering. The phrase children of Israel literally means sons of Israel. And this teaches that the sons of Israel place their hands upon offerings, but the daughters of Israel do not place their hands upon offerings. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon's say. It is optional for women to place their hands on the head of an offering before it is slaughtered, although they are not obligated to do so. Apparently, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon, if a woman wishes to perform any mitzvah that is not obligatory for her, she is permitted to do so. So here too, one does not prevent a woman from sounding the shofar.
Great. So I just want to like nerdy Talmudic moment of like technical terms. The word patur, it means exempted, meaning you don't have to do it, or you're not allowed it. The opposite of patur is chayav, right? You're obligated to do it. Reshut is another category that is it's mentioned here about women laying their hands on an offering, that it's reshut, that it is optional, meaning permitted, but not necessary, right? And then the opposite of reshut is chovah, right? You're obligated to do it, right? The men have to place their hands on the offering in order to establish ownership and to pronounce their sins for the offering, right? The women don't. One last thing is interesting. We see that this is a parallel structure to the one above, right? Rabbi Yehuda was pretty consistent in believing that women really couldn't fulfill anything, and that men had to do all the things. And Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, at least, looking at both of these things, women actually have the ability to do these things, although whether they have to do them or whether they're obligated to them doesn't really come around until, of course, you get Rabbeinu Tam later, implying it's permitted for women to blow the shofar and they should say the blessing over it. It's interesting, by the way, that the Women of the Wall citation is about tzitzit and not about shofar. And the reason for that is you got to go probably a lot farther down in the Rabbeinu Tam to figure out that he says you should say the blessing over the mitzvah, even if it's reshut, for all these different things. But as we see, it all derives from this text in shofar. Joe and then Marion.
My life experience tells me that you must be pragmatic. It's not something that you do sometimes, but you have to be pragmatic. For example, is it safer to cross at an intersection? There are intersections in Pittsburgh that do not have traffic lights or stop signs, four-way intersections. Is it safer to cross over there as a pedestrian or to cross in the middle of the street? Now, I would argue from a pragmatic point of view, it's safer to cross in the middle of that street because cars can only come at you from two directions. And likewise, I think we have to be pragmatic about all these interpretations. I have a problem right in the beginning where it defines what children of Israel means. On today's standards, we should not make the assumption, I cannot make the assumption that children of Israel was intended to mean sons of Israel. So likewise, in a text that was put together by such religious people in their time, does any of this represent what the common people did? And, you know, what did the common people do? We don't know. It's all an assumption. We have 7 billion people on Earth. Probably a majority of those people believe that there's one God, and we all worship that one God. And I'm making an assumption here. But each of us practices religious beliefs in a different way. I don't think you could find 2 people on the planet who agree on every religious practice, and they do exactly the same thing. Certainly not me and my wife.
Yep.
So as a conservative Jew, as a centrist Jew, we have to be open to everything. Even yesterday, we were watching 3 of our grandchildren. Why? Because mommy and daddy were doing a hard fast. And my grandson went to game club, and I took him to and from game club, and we had some one-on-one time while I was driving. And the question I was asked is mommy and daddy coming for dinner? And I said, no, because they're fasting. Which out of an 8-year-old posed the question, well, how come you're not fasting? And I had to explain why we don't fast, why mommy and daddy fast, and why the other set of grandparents are kind of doing a soft fast. Right. No eating, but they drink water.
Right.
And so this 8-year-old is processing all this information, just beginning to understand the complexity of life in Judaism.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's you know, the thing about this class is I try and be expansive and open-minded and try and show you, like I tried to show you how this text might have been interpreted by an Orthodox rabbi, or how Rabbeinu Tam might have interpreted it, and then how it got layered. And then I'd also pointed out, like, you know, what I think of it. And, you know, I'm a conservative rabbi. Now, the challenge I have as a conservative rabbi is I'm on the left vanguard of the conservative movement, meaning there's a lot of stuff I'm willing to throw out as anachronistic or no longer relevant based on my reading. But to Joe's point, I very much accept that I may not have the only right way of doing things. And the thing is, Joe, I got asked to be a rabbi. So people ask me, like, what should I do, Rabbi? I really encourage people to research things on their own and figure it out. But at the end of the day, one of the most annoying things a conservative rabbi says over and over again in giving people advice is, well, it depends. You know, like sometimes people just want to know which shoe to tie. You know, like they want to know, like, Rabbi, do I say Kiddush before or after I light the Havdalah candle? Like, that's it. It's, you know, stop giving me 17 different opinions from Tosafot and the Rishonim. All right, Marion, go ahead, and then we're going to call it a day. We'll start on 7 next week when I'm back in the United States, totally jet lagged, exhausted, and bedraggled.
I believe it. Okay. First of all, I think there are 2 things about this. First of all, I think in those days that most women, 90% of women, are relegated to full-time to taking care of the house and the kids and all that stuff. So they weren't thought of as being able to participate in all these different ways. That's number 1. Number 2, I think part of the problem is language. There is no neuter language in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. It's B'nai Yisrael, and there's a question of whether it means just the boys or all the children,
right? Because
there isn't a way of saying all the children.
Yep. You nailed it. I think, right. So that, and by the way, this is not my first rodeo with that problem. There are a number of other halachic disputes throughout the Talmud that arise out of exactly that phrase, Daber el Bnei Yisrael. I believe there's a section in Sukkah that deals with a similar problem. Hillel and Shammai are debating that. There's also a section, I don't remember where the rabbis are debating how many children you should have, and whether you fulfilled the obligation of pru or vu by having 2 children of any gender, or whether you must have at least 1 boy and 1 girl in order to fulfill the mitzvah of pru or vu. And I believe it has, one of the disagreements revolves around this issue, Daber el Bnei Yisrael. Like, is the word Bnei, does it constitute both genders as a gender non-specific plural term, or is it gendered specifically referring to the boys, right? So, but to your first point, Marion, it was really well said. One of the original ideas behind mitzvah aseh zman grama, positive time-bound commandments, is if Abba's got to be at morning minyan at 7:30 at Beth Shalom, so he can have 7 kinds of fish with D at 8:15, 8:30 if someone slows davening, not me, I daven fast. The question is, like, do you have childcare responsibilities, and do your childcare responsibilities preclude you? And if women have the childcare responsibilities, and you can't obligate them to show up to minyan. For me and my wife have always split the childcare obligations down the middle, which is why when I told Beth Shalom, I'll be at Monday, Wednesday evening minyan, and Thursday and Sunday morning minyan, because those are days in which my wife can watch the kids, they said, cool. And if they didn't say cool, I would have said, cool, egalitarianism just died. But, like, that's understandable, right? But, it won't stop Ira from complaining when I'm not at Minyan on Wednesday. So someone's got to make breakfast, someone's got to get him to school. My wife's already at work. So anyways, this was a wonderful excursion into questions around feminism and modern Judaism. I think all of you have gained a great appreciation for Rabbi Yossi and Rabbeinu Tam. Some of you are probably big Rabbi Yehuda fans, and that's okay. We hold by him too. I will be back in the States. For those of you who are in Carmiel, I will be at Shul right off the bus, right off the train, however far it takes to get from the train to the synagogue at, I think it's
15 minutes.
Everybody,
15
please,
minutes.
everybody, please read what Joe Jolson wrote. I thought it was beautiful.
Yes.
In the chat.
But someone will pick you up from the train station.
Oh, cool. Really?
Yes,
Really?
I believe Julie is planning to pick
Really?
you up.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very nice. How will she recognize me? I don't know if she's ever met me.
We'll send her a picture.
Yeah.
Tell her.
With your wife, or?
It seems like my wife is going to take the opportunity to kind of have a relaxing day without her husband. But it looks like my daughter wants to come. So you guys will all get to meet Etta, my 9-year-old.
Okay.
So
How old is your daughter?
9. She's 9.
Very good.
I think she just knows that 6 hours on a train is the maximum amount of opportunity she's going to get to have screen time. So, but I also,
You're coming by train from Jerusalem? Because I did that the other day and it was lovely. You change it.
I love the train.
Yeah, the trains are really quite lovely.
it's going to be exciting.
I have to tell you, the Yitzhak Navon station, you have to go down like 4 or 5 different escalators to get to the train. It's a
I'll figure out.
marvel.
I'll figure it out.
Today.
I'll figure it out. I'm a veteran in Israel. First of all, I'm not too embarrassed to speak English if I need to. But the second thing is I'm a veteran of receiving instructions in Hebrew, where it's always like smola yemina smola yashar al hasof utishol mishu acher. Right, like right, straight, and then ask somebody else. Right.
I went by train on Thursday, and the signposts at Jerusalem station now are much, much better than they were 6 months ago when I last went. We're really, really impressive. Yeah. It was
Great.
great.
Will you have class Wednesday?
No class Wednesday. No
Class Wednesday.
I gotta go up to, Also, the timing for that class is a mess, right? A noon class here, and the Israelis know, a noon class here is already like 8 o'clock at night. Plus I'm on vacation.
Okay.
Will you be at,
We'll see you on Wednesday.
Monday?
Will I be at
Shola Monday morning.
Probably not for Minion, but maybe. We'll see. It
For
depends on
Talmud?
for Talmud for sure.
Okay.
Okay,
For sure.
I will keep the coffee on.
I may be half unconscious and like looking like this, but I'll be there. All right, bye everybody. Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of
Bye-bye.
your
Leave
vacation.
well
I will.
Wednesday.